because there is this Trinitarian hell that takes place on the cross. But the unity of the Godhead is the key to the unity that he has placed in humanity. The enemy understands that God functions in a unified way. Therefore, if he wants to keep God out, he creates dysfunction.
Welcome to Tony Evans Daily. Real faith, real purpose, every single day. Let's get into today's message.
Unity is not sameness of persons. It's oneness of purpose. He brings the Godhead into this. He talks about the Spirit and the Lord and God. And to understand why this is a big deal, you have to understand theology proper. Theology proper starts with the triune God. One God composed of three co-equal persons, Father, Son, Spirit, who are one in essence while being distinct in personhood. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, but they all three together make up the one Godhead. All of the ingredients of Godhead belongs to all three members of the Godhead. But while each of the members of the Godhead are distinct as persons, they are not distinct in purpose. The unity of the Godhead is their oneness of purpose as they share in the same divine nature. The only time there was a breach in this was on the cross when Jesus said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So you have a disruption of sorts that takes place. And I don't, God would have to explain how God could stop being God without stopping to be God so he could be God for us. Because there is this Trinitarian hell that takes place on the cross. But the unity of the Godhead is the key to the unity that he has placed in humanity. The enemy understands that God functions in a unified way. Therefore, if he wants to keep God out, he creates dysfunction. Because he knows God won't show up and show off where disunity has been normalized. So if he can get you fussing, cussing, and fighting within yourself, within your home, within the nation or the races or the culture, if he can do that, then he knows God won't hear your prayers. 1 Peter 3:7, he says the husband who's disunified from his wife, his prayers are hindered. But he comes right around in 1 Corinthians 7:5, and he says, but the husband and wife who come together in agreement can get through to heaven. It was their unity. So the reason Satan has y'all fighting is because he knows your church attendance won't matter. He knows your prayer meetings won't matter. Have you ever noticed how somebody in your life who you're in conflict with, you start off fighting about one thing that's small. But like David Ruffin says, it's growing. You know, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now you cussing each other out over something that was tiny when you started. That's because Satan intervened into the argument in order to create the discord, in order to keep God away. Unity is oneness of purpose. Jesus comes and he says, I'm coming to glorify the Father. The Holy Spirit says, I'm coming to glorify Christ. Because they are all involved in the glory of God. That's why Romans chapter 16, verse 17, in fact, I'll read a couple of scriptures today because this is so critical to get God back involved. He says in verse 17, now I urge you, brethren, keep your eye on those who cause dissensions and hindrances contrary to the teaching which you learned, and turn away from them. For such men are slaves, not of the Lord Christ, but of their own appetites. He says, watch out for disunifiers. Watch out for folk who want to turn race into a cudgel. because they don't want unity. They want to keep division going. And so they'll stir up things to keep the racial divide intact, even in the kingdom of God, so that God will be kept at bay no matter how many can we all get along meetings that you have. It says, watch out for dissenters, disunifiers. One of the things we have to do as counseling is determine which party, or whether it's both parties, are keeping disunity going because they don't want it fixed. Because if they do, then God is not involved. Watch out for disunifiers. Unity is not uniformity. It's not everybody being the same. It is everybody being on the same agenda. Paul in 1 Corinthians 1 verses 10 to 13 condemns the church at Corinth for developing a personality cult, where people were choosing personalities that they would align with, that was creating havoc and disunity in the church. A 100 pianos tuned to the same tuning fork will intrinsically be tuned to one another. And he says the Holy Spirit is the emulsifier. He is the link that pulls together the unity. And the more you can get spiritual unity, the more of God you can experience. The less you have spiritual unity, the less of God you will experience. It's that key and that important in our lives, in our homes, and most certainly in our world. A football team is made up of 11 different positions on each side of the ball. Last time I checked, there's only one goal line, because the different positions are only moving toward that common purpose, which is that goal line. Different races, different backgrounds, different cultures, different positions, but one goal line. Unity is oneness of purpose. It is moving in the same direction because you want God involved in the legitimacy of the goal. Now, there's a standard for unity, because there are limitations. In Ephesians 4, he says this a little bit later in the chapter. He says in verse 13, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be tossed around here and there by waves and carried by every wind of doctrine, by the trickiness of men, by craftiness of deceitful scheming, but speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up into all aspects under him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by that which every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. He says, until we all attain to the unity of the faith. You divide over two things, sin and false doctrine. Those two things you divide over, sin and false doctrine. They are designed to create divinely ordained division. But apart from those two things, he says, you all attain, and you have a goalpost here, speaking the truth in love. You want truth and love. You want God's standard being proclaimed, that's truth. You want God's heart being felt, that's love. And once you have those two goalposts, you can kick unity for your success. When God's standard can rule and God's heart can be expressed, you can have unity in the situation that you face, I face, or we face, which will give us the privilege of returning to God, because then God will be free to return to us. Unless the church does something with all that's happening in the culture, there is no hope. He says in this passage, the unity of the faith, and then he says, for the body to build itself up in love.